for the benefit of people who might not have been here for previous sessions, I just want to give the usual brief outline. The reason why we're looking at the Gospel of Thomas here is because there's sort of a larger, broader body of Christian and Jewish literature that is handed down to us, and sort of the legitimate question is whether or not any of these things hold any purpose or any inspiration, and the idea is that how would you go about knowing this if it were to be the case. As far as what we take to be canon, there are multiple canons that exist. It's a little hard to appeal to an external authority because there isn't a 100% universal agreement. And when you go back and, as Dr. Mizik mentioned before, the canon wasn't established until very late, and even the early canon lists that did exist were largely inconsistent with one another. And some of these canon lists, for example, they left out books like Hebrews, and they left out books like Jude, and they left out books like Revelation, while others included books such as the Apocalypse of Peter. They included books that we no longer accept as canon. So the whole idea is that it's very murky as far as that's concerned. That is in no way to suggest that anything that we do have within the boundaries of our canon is anything but inspired. But the idea is that as far as learning or understanding something, that there has to be some basis for us to understand what is and what is not based on some kind of criteria that exists outside of mere authority alone, because many authorities exist. There's Greek Orthodox, and they have their canon and their teaching and their whole body of teaching. There's the Catholic Church, and they have their canon and their whole body of teaching. You have the Protestant Church, which again inherited scriptures that they've subsequently decanonized, basically. You know what I'm saying? So it's not as cut and dried as people think. And so it's important to understand if there is some kind of basis for knowing what that basis should be. One of the things that I mentioned last week, but I'll mention again since it bears mentioning, is there happens to exist within the book of Jude something that's very interesting, an interesting passage, really, a couple of interesting passages. When you read Jude 14 and 15, for example, the quote roughly goes that he says that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men, and we're talking about the people who are infiltrating the church, saying, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all and convict all that are ungodly among them of all the ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed." And so the point I was trying to make is that there's a literary argument. There's an internal argument based on what Jude is saying here that argues that Enoch, for example, is the name of this book. So he's identifying the book by its title and by the author of that book. So he might as well be saying, this is the author of this book, right? So, you know what I'm saying? Just as a literary parenthetical, you should be able to read that into what he's saying. Yes. So his entire presentation is that this is the name of the book, and then he gives him his antiquity. He says he's the seventh from Adam, so he's arguing that this book is ancient, yes, right? And then he says that he prophesied. So he's arguing that this book is prophecy, right? And then it's with regards to these people who are infiltrating the church. So it takes it out of the antediluvian age and makes it applicable to his day and age, yes, right? Yes. And then the quote itself serves really two functions. Number one, it's to identify that this book is basically for the end times because it refers to his coming, the Lord's coming. He says, "Behold, the Lord cometh with." And the other thing, too, is it's a very lengthy quote. So in case there's any question in anybody's mind, if the Enoch that he's talking about, that particular book, is the one that we have in our possession, right? The very fact that it's a long, drawn-out, lengthy quote makes it possible to identify for certain that he's talking about that very book. It makes it possible. So if you just paraphrase, see, it's a literary argument. It's something where you don't even have to really be a believer, because you could go to an atheist, you could go to a Muslim, you could go to a Christian for that matter, and point out, listen, Jude is identifying the name of the source. He's identifying, he's asserting that it's ancient. He's asserting that it's prophetic. He's asserting that it bears on his age, and he's also asserting that it bears on the coming of the Lord. So he's basically taken it out of the antediluvian age and extending its applicability all the way to our times, right? And then if you further go into the book of Enoch and you read just Enoch 1, just the whole chapter, but just the beginning of that chapter, and remember he's quoting Enoch 1:9. So if he's made it all the way down to Enoch 1:9, you can basically presume that he started from Enoch 1. He knows all this stuff from Enoch 1 all the way down to Enoch 1:9 because he's applying it.
Yeah, so the real question is, do we consider Jude canon? Because if you consider Jude canon, then you have to accept Thomas.
Well, see, that's sort of the double bind that people are in. That's why I think a lot of this stuff gets swept under the rug, because actually the Bible is replete with allusions to this book. But this is the case in the Bible that's the most clear cut, because he literally gives it the title of the book, the antiquity of the book, the prophetic nature of the book, the applicability of the book to his time and a future age, right? And so you can't just sweep that under the rug, right? You have to sort of address that, and you really could either accept it or reject it. But like you mentioned, it puts you in a double bind.
Christopher Ray would say it's still being investigated.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No comment.
For people who
That's
have
under
read
investigation,
the
I
book
can't
of
talk
Enoch,
about it.
Jesus quoted from the book of Enoch, because when Joseph and I read the book of Enoch together out loud, we heard Jesus saying some of those phrases that are in the book of Enoch.
Yeah, I mean, you know, well, like the meek shall inherit the earth, for example. There would be many mansions, for example. Those kinds of things. There are allusions to what's written in the book of Enoch. Not to mention that when the book, when he's identified as the elect one, that when in the book of Luke anyway, where he said when God calls out Yeshua, he says, "This is my son." In the Lucan version, it identifies him as the elect one, you know, which is another striking parallel, because that's a title that he's known by in the book of Enoch. So it's kind of an interesting aside. So it sort of begs the question as to why it is that these things get swept under the rug. Because number one, it's kind of the easy thing to do. The presumption is that if we're going to stick with the canon that we've been given, in other words, we've got a story and we're sticking to it, right? But is that really proper? The Bible even goes so far as to say, let God be true and every man a liar. And sort of implies that God is going to be true in the face of what every man has said, is sort of the implication there.
Like Israel would never return.
But so it sort of begs the question, if let's say you entertain the idea that Enoch is to be included, or at least considered, right? And just look at that. One of the things that if you've read the book of Enoch and you get all the way down to 104 and 105, one of the things it talks about is that scriptures will be given to the wise and the righteous, right? And that they will be given the understanding of these scriptures, and they are going to be able to reveal them to the world. And it says to them, because to reveal it to them is actually what it says, it's a command. And it says, because you are a reward upon this earth, right? And so it opens kind of this door. Now, the other side of this story is that Jude doesn't just stand by itself. There's another book in the New Testament that's basically written around the book of Jude, which is 2 Peter, which if you look at the parallels between 2 Peter and Jude, you know, it's like maybe 70-80% of Jude is contained in 2 Peter. So it sort of begs the question as to why it is that Peter might have collaborated with or else written around the book of Jude. Whatever the case, it does include almost all of the book, including reference to the incident with Michael the archangel. Although it does seem to water it down somewhat. It says, "And angels also, which are more powerful, do not bring accusations against them in the presence of the Lord." So it gives us that additional detail. But in Jude it says, "And Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil about the body of Moses, did not bring a railing accusation." He's very particular in Jude.
If you take 2 Peter, parts of 2 Peter, and then the the Epistle of Jude, put them side to side, you can see it's incorporated a lot of Jude into his.
Almost
Some link the 2 Peter to Hebrews as well. They say there's a link there.
Well, in Hebrews it's very interesting too, because if you're reading Hebrews 11, which is the chapter of faith, right? As you start getting down to it, it makes an allusion to the second book of Maccabees, or at least the events contained within the second book of Maccabees, as though it were a part of Jewish history, as though it were part of the, you know, the message about the heroes. You know what I'm saying? It includes allusions to apocryphal stories, or at least apocryphal, you know, quote unquote legends or whatever. But that's all part of, you know, the celebration of the heroes of Israel in the chapter of faith. So that sort of also begs the question: is if Jude is reading this book, the book of Enoch, and Peter is validating the book of Jude at least, and if also you read in the book of Hebrews that he's validating second Maccabees, and very likely the martyrdom of Isaiah, because he does mention prophets being sawn in half, and that was established book at the time. You know, whether you choose to believe it or not, the fact is that even though what we accept as canon is constantly making references and sometimes offhanded allusions to these books as though they were real, as though they were valid. You know what I'm saying? You have to at least look at these things. You have to at least look at these things, because what if these things are significant? You know, I mean, if you've got two choices in the case of Jude, where you can say, look, I can accept that Jude is canonical, but I can't really accept that Enoch is canonical. You have to bring a whole lot of how should I say? You have to kind of cast shade on Jude a little bit to do that. You have to say, listen, I disagree with him and his assessment, which seems basically largely unchristian, just on the surface of it, to question the prophets. As a matter of fact, a person might say that questioning the Holy Spirit, or what is Holy Writ, you know what I'm saying, is you know, something that we could maybe be suffering for, let's say. You know, because if it does have to do with that, let's just say that it does, and we ignore it, that means we'll never get to that point where we understand it, so long as we do that, that door remains shut, right? And in Revelation it talks about that. I've given you an open door that no man can shut, and that is an open door. And when Peter writes around the book of Jude, he does mention that, you know, if you had faith, knowledge to your faith, and perseverance and all this other stuff, then it says a door will be open to you.
And we look through a glass darkly, but it's going to become clearer. But it is
clearer. An entrance. If that happens to be a case, now, to allay some, you know, the fears that might be there, you could say, well, that's a slippery slope. What happens if you do that? Enoch doesn't just limit it to its own book. It talks about other scriptures, other books and stuff. Right. So there would have to be some way of knowing. And so the idea is that the way that you would know is through a spiritual language that you would come to learn, rather than being told from the outside in or from the top down, like religion has always been taught to us. But again, it teaches us not only different canons, but also different teachings on those canons, and places different importance on, you know. And it isn't to negate the fact that there are priests and ministers and leaders and so on of the church. The fact is, if I'm a leader of the church and I'm affirming Jude, right, then that would seem to me to be probably the safer path than to be a leader of the church and negating Jude. Amen. Right? And so the idea is this a Pandora's box? Is this a slippery slope, or is this something foundational that you can stand on? It's a legitimate question, yes, and it should be addressed. But the thing is, I feel like as a Christian, it's a much more solid ground to stand with the prophets themselves than with the teachings of men. Even if the teachings of men are long-standing, even if they're basically all pervasive, because again, let God be true and every man a liar. So why the Gospel of Thomas in particular? Well, you could just about pick any one of these books. These books have been handed to us in the Nag Hammadi Codices. There's a few of those books that I can probably explain just as well as I can explain the Gospel of Thomas, and in some cases I have. Like, I've done an exposition on the Gospel of Truth, for example, that exists on my channel. That's gotten a lot of positive response from people. But I have addressed these other books as well in other places on my channel. But the Gospel of Thomas is one that's sort of unique in that it tells you that it is a book of riddles, it is a book of mysteries. One of the things that it says, first thing it says, is that these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas wrote down, who's called Thomas, wrote down. And he said, whoever finds the interpretations of these sayings will not experience death, and let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled, and when he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. And then the Greek adds, and in reigning or in ruling he shall rest, right? So coming to find the answer means you're no longer seeking, you're no longer looking, but you've actually come to find it. And so that ties in with what Enoch is saying, that share your understanding with them because you are a reward upon the earth. That's what it says in 104 and 105. That's sort of the gist of those two chapters there. So the idea is if you do stumble upon the answer, you do stumble upon the argument that's laid down, that it's basically incumbent to teach it and to lift it up in the churches. Now I know we left off last time at Logian 99, and there's no way, especially in the time that we have allotted, I'll make it all the way to the end. In fact, probably can only address one or two of these things in the time that we have. But again, I felt like it was important, to reiterate and to preface this by saying, this isn't just some weird off-the-wall thing. This isn't about trying to lead people down, the wrong path, or trying to, as Paul says, preach another gospel or whatever,
add to the
or allow
word.
them to be accursed or whatever, who do such things. I just wanted to point that out, that these are things that are existent within the gospels that we do accept and within the scriptures that we do accept. And I think like the Bereans, for example, that you should search things out at least before jumping or to conclusions or drawing any conclusions, because these things are based on the scriptures that we have. So in Logian 100 it says, they showed Jesus a gold coin and said to him, Caesar's men demand taxes from us. He said to them, give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and God what belongs to God, and give me what is mine. So basically that tracks with the canon except for that last part. You don't see that in the canonical sayings, and I think that's the controversial part. This is one of those tough sayings that a lot of people reject. So that's kind of a tough one to just start out on, especially when you don't have a lot of time to really build on it. But the idea is that he shut them up because there is such thing as a sacred and the profane. The world of here and now and the kingdom of heaven. These are things that are contrasted obviously throughout the scriptures. But the idea of Yeshua saying, give me what is mine, that has led a lot of scholars and naysayers and stuff to say, to sort of insinuate that the Gospel of Thomas is giving Jesus a certain self-importance or whatever that he otherwise doesn't have, that he's sort of vaunting himself above the Father or something. And I think that that's a little bit misguided. Because there's a lot of things that Yeshua says in the canonical scriptures, again, because those are always going to be your final authority on anything. Nobody's trying to usurp the authority of any of this stuff, trying to see the commonality and the relationship, right? But not to usurp. There's nothing in this stuff that's going to negate anything that you accept if it's true, right? So that's the key. If it's true, if it's right. There are a lot of things that Yeshua says that he is going to do. In fact, we just talked about that last week, about I have works to perform that I'm doing today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will be perfected, right? Remember we talked about that last week. The idea is that he has works that he is performing, and that on the third day he is to be perfected. Now, I'm asserting that his perfection on the third day implies that for those 2 days or 2,000 years, because again a day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years are as a day, we are going to know him imperfectly, right? Because the perfection has to do with the works that he's doing for those 2,000 years. So in other words, if he's laying down prophecy and he's laying down statements about the future, and that these 2 days or these 2,000 years, in other words, are going to elapse, and then on the third day he is perfected, right? That means that we are going to have an imperfect knowledge for those 2 days or those 2,000 years, and then on that third day or that third millennium, we will be able to see the works that he did, because we will come to see him in his perfection, right? And so my contention is that coming to understand his teaching and to understand him in that light is in fact giving him what is his, because that is the function of his works, and the works that he's going to do
Wow.
for
Of
those
course,
2 days.
That's good.
Everything's
Right.
gonna be laid at the feet of Christ eventually.
So,
God's gonna be
and,
all in all.
and so, in other words, at that particular time, his works will have come to fruition, and therefore he is owed what he has, put his
That makes
labor and
sense
his life
now.
into. So we should give it, to be slang, to give it up to him, you know what I'm saying? To give him what is his, because he's earned it. In fact, in the book of Revelation, it talks about how his feet were as brass, and that his breastplate was of gold and silver, as though it had been tried in a fire. You know what I'm saying? As if to say there is a trial that lies ahead for him, and at his revelation, right, then that's going to be, it's going to be symbolic of his perfection, right? And so that ties in with on the third day, he will be perfected. So, in 101, that's just the next lotion, it says, whoever does not hate his father and his mother as I do cannot become a disciple to me, and whoever does not love his father and mother as I do cannot become a disciple to me. For my mother, and there's a lacuna there, but it says, but my
A
true
what?
mother gave me life.
A lacuna is from the archaeology, when something that's been lost by decay and age, because this was written on papyrus.
So there's a missing
which
word, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
You can see it there.
Yeah.
There's the hole in the text. So it's somewhat speculative, but I think it can easily be reconstructed, because the first part of that statement I don't even really need to address too much, because that's in the canon.
Right.
Whoever does not hate his father and mother as I do cannot become a disciple to me. But he's giving you the key here. He's saying, for my mother, blank, but my true mother gave me life. So, but it's a contrast. So you can infer that if he's talking about his true mother giving him life, then his earthly mother must be giving him something that contrasts with life. And since life and death are the constant theme throughout the Gospel of Thomas, it isn't unreasonable to suggest that the proper fill here for that lacuna is that my mother gave me death, or gave me something that is contrasted with life, right? So, but I think it's a contrast between
Right.
life and death, because again, in the beginning, he says, whoever finds the interpretations of these sayings will not taste it, or will not experience death, or will not taste death, right? So what he would be saying, if in fact the word death is what is implied here, is that it would be ignorance or not understanding, as opposed to the spiritual
Jesus
understanding.
did die, but death really has, in the end, has no authority over him. Remember, it says in the Bible, you shall not allow your Holy One to see corruption.
Yes.
And
The book
even
of
the
Psalms.
Gospel of Thomas affirms the deity of Christ, right?
Right.
He shares in the, all the attributes of God apply to Yeshua, according to the Scriptures and the Gospels, honestly. And I think it's important. I've heard people say, like atheists, agnostics, it's, oh, you Christians, you believers, you believe in family values, and Jesus is against family values. It's like, well, we put God above all things, and like I said, that's not entirely true. Jesus pointed to the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
What must I do to have eternal life? Honor your father and your mother. When Jesus was on the cross, his last thought was, I'm going to make sure my mother is being taken care of.
Right.
Yeah, we do put God above family. That's what makes family work, right? If you
Yeah.
put family above God, or anything above God, it's not.